Well, welcome to Chapter 2 and Lesson 2 based on Wheeler's great book, Security Risk Management. And what we're going to be doing during this particular lesson is looking at risky business. We're going to be looking at business-driven risk, and we're going to do, after we cover the kind of core materials that are in the book, we're going to explore some additional articles that look at cultural theory, that look at risk-based budgeting and some other related topics that provide a good intro to looking at this and build upon what we covered during Chapter 1. So Chapter 2 and the associated readings, we're going to take about 7 videos to cover that material, and this is the first of those 7 videos. All right, well, let's get into it. So the kind of agenda that we have for Chapter 2 is this idea of looking at risk management, doing a little compare and contrast, if you will, with information security. Again, a little bit of review based on what we covered last class. We'll then get into the goals of risk management, talk about business-driven security program, very briefly talk about security as an investment, qualitative versus quantitative analysis. We're going to spend a couple of chapters talking about that later on. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the global map of risk, and we'll look at some sites that allow you to do that through a in-class lesson that we're going to cover during, or in-class exercise that we're going to cover during the second video. All right, enough on that. Let's get into the material. Now we know what the agenda is. So if we start on this particular slide in that upper left, you kind of see the kind of 4 characteristics of information as it relates to security. So you're talking about confidentiality. Can I read the information? Integrity. Can I change the information? Availability. Is the information available to others? And then accountability. Do we know who did what to whom associated with that information? When you couple that with some principles associated with risk management, in other words, the probable frequency and magnitude of a future loss, both of which you got to calculate, you then get this idea of probable frequency and magnitude of future loss of the confidentiality, integrity, availability, or accountability associated with specific information. All right, so it's one way of looking at. Another way of looking at this, and again, we talked about this during Lesson 1, but important to revisit, and specifically we talked about it during the HIPAA portion of the videos, is this idea that you have a bunch of assets out there, and those assets could be information, it could be servers, it could be people, it could be processes, it could be education and training approaches. So all of those things could be policy. All of those things are assets, and you need to be able to characterize all of those different assets out there. And as you look at Georgia State University, University of Alabama at Birmingham, in both cases, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of different assets that have an impact on risk management. Some of those assets are going to have, in fact, many of them are going to have vulnerabilities or weaknesses associated with them that could be leveraged or exploited by threats. And when you couple all of those together, that where you've got an asset within your environment, you've got a vulnerability within your environment, and then you have a threat actor that is aware that you have that asset and vulnerability or figure it out, that's where you have risk. And what you want to be able to do is not eliminate all risk from the organization. That's impossible. The idea, again, that you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of assets, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of vulnerabilities, and then you've got a numerous amount, I don't even want to categorize, of threats that are out there, means that you're probably not going to be able to eliminate all risk, but what you do want to do is get the risk to an acceptable level within the organization. All right, so we've talked a little bit on this slide about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and accountability, the more traditional way of looking at information security. And we've kind of morphed it, if you will, into risk management and talking about assets and vulnerabilities and threats and that interaction between the three generating risk. And this idea that the probable frequency and magnitude of those things help shape how much risk we're going to have to those information security characteristics of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and accountability. As we're looking at this, we're talking about a process not for doing information security or risk management for information security or risk management's case, but doing it for the business. In other words, being able to calculate to a certain extent a return on investment for the funds that are going into your security program. And you'll see these kind of tenets throughout the entire course, this idea that you have to work smarter, not harder. The idea that if you've got hundreds of thousands of assets, you going out with a sheet of paper and manually listing them is probably not a good use of your time. That you may want to instead use automated tools to do that. You may want to start with what you perceive are those assets with the highest risk, those critical servers, and securing them first before moving on to addressing a computer or consumer-based devices, depending on your environment. The second is looking at how does risk management and information security interact? Who do they report to? What's their shared governance? How do those work together to improve the organization? This idea of due diligence and facilitating decision making. That again, you're not going to be able to address every possible risk, but what you can do is document the risk decisions you make. Be thoughtful, structured in your approach of how you do things. And this kind of goes back to that idea earlier of working smarter, not harder, making conscious decisions of we're not going to address the millions of assets. We're going to start with those security tools. We're going to start with a known framework as our basis for doing those evaluations. Again, kind of a thoughtful, structured approach for doing this. And a good example of this is to go and look at how PCI, or the Security Standards Council, as it relates to credit cards, addresses risk. So if you're a very small vendor with a very small transaction amount and a very small dollar amount associated with those transactions, then the security required is is just a baseline security. But as you become a larger and larger processor of credit card information, the standards increase in terms of their rigor, in terms of the amount of security that is, and risk management that's being applied to ensure that the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and accountability associated with those credit card transactions are protected. So it's a really good example of a business-driven security program, a security program based on risk that scales based on some pretty easily devised metrics that allow them to measure the potential risk that a potential vendor has within their environment. And the book has a good little sidebar. You should go and read that and make sure that you understand that. Another good example of this is looking at email. And we'll spend some more time on this later in the course. But when you look at kind of the three key characteristics associated with email, traditionally we've talked about, well, what's the length of the password? How long is the password good for? And how often do we have to renew it? And if you've been following guidance from National Institute of Standards and Technology, over the last 25 years, it's been their focus on special characters and, all sorts of things. We're going to remember every password you've ever done and not allow you to reuse them and all of those sorts of stuff. And basically what NIST has come to discover is that none of that really works, that humans are involved, human behavior is involved, and people tend to pick a password and then use very simple mutations of that password on lots and lots of other sites. And if one of those sites becomes compromised, then all of the sites using that simple password or permutation of a password become compromised. And so what has come out of this is a revision based more on risk. And basically what they've said is, let's just focus on password length. Okay? And let's not worry about all these other characteristics, but if you have a sufficiently long password, say 15 characters or so, that the password is not the issue. People will die before enough computers are brought to bear to crack that password. And that it's easier for humans to remember if they use a passphrase, and we don't have all these strange requirements associated with it. And so what they've kind of proposed is this movement towards passwords that never expire, but are pretty long, and that are easy to remember, because that length is really the key determination on protecting the password. And that's a more risk management based approach to it, a more practical approach, I would argue, for doing passwords. All right, here's another good example of this idea of business-driven security. So if for all of our security investments we could generate a chart associated like this, then our decisions become really, really easy. And so in this case, that red line are the costs associated with a software security failure, a compromise, if you will. And then the blue line is the cost of the measure itself. Okay? And so as you're looking at this potential chart where you're trying to map your security program is to look for initiatives that are at D, where the cost of an incident is equal to the cost of the security measure, assuming cost is your only measure of that. So you're trying to minimize the cost while maximizing the benefit associated with the program. And you can see some different points along the way. Let's go to point A, where the cost due to the security failure greatly exceed the expenditure of countermeasures. Okay? And so what happens there, if you look at A, you're spending too little money on security compared to the cost of a failure. If you look at B, you're spending a lot of money on security measures, and your cost of a security failure is actually quite low. But the challenge, of course, is getting a chart like this that maps it out. And obviously, where the two intersect, point D, is where, at least from a financial perspective, the two are related. You know, you're relatively close. And I will tell you, having worked in the security industry for a number of years, a lot of things are done with FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's your argument. It's not a chart like this. And if we did have charts like this, it would be a lot easier to get investments within security. The last slide that we're really going to cover in this first of 7 videos is this idea of quantitative versus qualitative. And this idea that if we can map the likelihood and severity, which we talked about earlier, in some type of a formula, and you see a couple of different formulas there for calculating things, then even in this kind of simplistic way of a qualitative mapping, you can start to say, well, why don't we focus on things that have a high likelihood and a high severity associated with them, and we'll ignore, at least for the moment, those things that have a low likelihood and a low severity, and then we'll have to make some decisions for those things in between. But this gives you a kind of simplistic evaluation system for doing that. And again, given the sheer number of possible vulnerabilities, threats, and assets, using something simple like this means that you can move to something that's more achievable. All right, well, very good. We've covered some of the underlying ideas behind business-driven risk, and what we're going to do in the next video is start to, we'll do a quick class exercise, getting an idea about the threat that is out there. So keep on studying, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.